There's a quiet studio somewhere in the South. The microphone still stands, and if you listen closely, you can almost hear the echo of a voice that once defined what soul could feel like. He sang about love and heartbreak, about truth and forgiveness, turning ordinary stories into something sacred. But somewhere between the spotlight and the shadows, the world moved on. The songs remained, but the man who wrote them slowly disappeared from the picture. How does someone so deeply woven into the sound of America become a stranger to its memory? His name was Don Covay, a voice, a writer, a soul that refused to be forgotten. Let's get into his story right now. Let me know where you're watching this from in the comments. Grab a warm drink, sit back, and let's begin this journey together. Donald Randolph Covay was born on the 24th of March, 1936, in Orangeburg, South Carolina. He grew up in a small wooden house near the church where his father preached every Sunday. His father was a Baptist pastor, a man whose voice carried power, rhythm, and conviction. When Don was only 8, that voice went silent. His father passed away, leaving the family with little more than faith and a few hymns that still lingered in the air. His mother moved the family to Washington, D.C., hoping for a new start. The city was buzzing with gospel choirs and young black musicians who sang like they had something to prove. Don was one of them. With his brothers and sisters, he formed a small gospel group called the Cherry Keys. They sang in church basements and community halls, simple songs about grace, hardship, and survival. But even as he lifted his voice toward heaven, something inside him was restless. He loved gospel, but he also loved the sound coming through the neighborhood jukebox, Little Richard, Chuck Berry, the early rumblings of rock and roll. Those rhythms spoke to something raw and alive in him. In middle school, a few of his classmates convinced him to try singing secular music. It was a decision that would change his life. By 1953, he joined the Rainbows, a doo-wop group that had once charted a national hit called Mary Lee. Don wasn't there for the fame, he was there to learn. He watched the older singers rehearse harmonies under flickering streetlights, blending voices until they sounded like one. Their first recording together, Shirley, came in 1956. It wasn't a hit, but Don didn't care. For the first time, he heard his own voice coming back through the studio speakers, not as a church boy or a dreamer, but as an artist. He stayed with the group a little longer, chasing the spark that had ignited something inside him. Contrary to popular belief, this lineup of the Rainbows didn't include Marvin Gaye or Billy Stewart, though both young singers would occasionally fill in during live performances. It was a time of energy, youth, and experimentation. For Don, it was also the beginning of understanding how fragile the music world could be, how one hit could make you, and the next day, you could be forgotten. By the late 1950s, Don found himself face to face with his idol, Little Richard. He toured as Richard's driver, road manager, and sometimes his opening act. He studied the man's every move, the energy, the defiance, the way he commanded a room. Watching Richard perform was like watching lightning strike. Don realized that art wasn't about perfection, it was about power. In 1957, he recorded his first solo single, Bip Bop Bip, produced by Little Richard himself. The record didn't sell, but for Don, it was another step, another doorway into the unpredictable world of rhythm and blues. The years that followed were full of movement. He bounced between small record labels, recording singles that went unnoticed but revealed a growing confidence in his voice. Songs like Switchin' in the Kitchen, Standing in the Doorway, and Cause I Love You hinted at a new style, part gospel, part street corner, part rebellion. In 1961, he landed briefly at Columbia Records, where he released Shake with the Snake and See About Me Baby. The songs didn't chart, but Columbia executives saw something different in him, a writer's instinct. He could shape words into melody, stories into rhythm. That same year, Don teamed up with fellow Rainbow alum John Barry to write a new dance tune called Pony Time. He recorded it first for a small label, and for the first time, one of his songs hit the charts. But the real surprise came when Chubby Checker recorded his version, turning Pony Time into a #1 hit across the nation. The joy of that moment was bittersweet. Don's words were everywhere, yet his name was buried in the fine print. He learned his first hard lesson about the music business. Talent doesn't always bring recognition. Still, he kept writing, kept performing, kept believing. Washington had given him discipline. The South had given him soul. and Little Richard had shown him what it meant to own the stage. By the early 1960s, Don Covay was no longer the boy from the church choir. He was a man chasing his sound, a voice born in gospel, tempered by struggle, and ready to echo through the heart of American music. Before the fame, before the lights, there was just a dream, and Don Covay, standing alone at the edge of it, ready to begin. By the early 1960s, Don Covay had learned how to survive in an industry that rarely played fair. He was no longer just a singer, he was a hustler, a dreamer, a man who wrote songs late at night, hoping that one of them might buy him another day of believing. After years of small labels and small stages, his sound was finally taking shape. There was grit in his voice now, the kind that comes from disappointment and persistence. He began to write more than he sang, crafting stories that blended gospel sincerity with streetwise humor. It was his way of making sense of a world that didn't always make sense to him. Then came the moment that changed everything. Teaming up once again with his old friend John Barry, Don wrote a playful little tune called Pony Time. It was a song about joy, about movement, about life refusing to sit still. He recorded it first for a small label, backed by a local band called the Good Timers. The single climbed modestly onto the Billboard pop chart, peaking at number 60. But the story didn't end there. A young chubby checker heard the song and decided to record his own version. Within months, Pony Time was sitting at number 1 on both the pop and R&B charts. The whole country was dancing to Don Covay's words, even if they didn't know his name. That success could have been his ticket to stardom, but fate had other plans. The royalties were small, the credit smaller, and the spotlight belonged to someone else. Still, for Don, it was proof that he had something special, a voice on paper that could move people. He continued writing and recording, moving between labels like Scepter and Cameo Parkway. Each song carried a different shade of soul. The Popeye Waddle, Wiggle Wobble, Ain't That Silly. They didn't burn up the charts, but they gave him room to experiment, to merge humor and heartbreak the way only he could. Even when the records didn't sell, his songs found life through other artists. He wrote You Can Run But You Can't Hide for Jerry Butler, Letter Full of Tears for Gladys Knight and the Pips, and Mr. Twister for Connie Francis. His lyrics began to echo through radios across America, sometimes sung by others, but always born from his heart. By 1964, his persistence began to pay off. Don signed with the small Rosemart label, and it was there that he recorded the song that would define the next chapter of his life, Mercy, Mercy. Backed by a young guitarist named Jimi Hendrix, the track was electric, raw, and unfiltered. It cracked the Billboard Top 40 and became an instant R&B classic. For the first time, Don Covay wasn't just a name in the liner notes. He was a man on the radio, a voice with swagger, soul, and something to say. The industry had no idea how to categorize him. Too rock for gospel, too gospel for rock, too human for a system built on image. But Don didn't care. He finally sounded like himself. In a decade defined by stars who shined and vanished overnight, Don Covay was building something slower, something deeper, a legacy made, not of fame, but of truth. And as the world danced to Mercy, Mercy, it was only the beginning of the sound that would change everything for him. After Mercy, Mercy hit the airwaves in 1964, something began to shift. Don Covay was no longer just writing hits for others, he was shaping the future of soul music itself. The song had everything that defined him, a swagger that felt street-born, a church rooted in intensity, and that unmistakable rasp that made every line sound like a confession. But what most listeners didn't know was that the young guitarist behind that record was Jimi Hendrix, still unknown, still hungry. In the studio, Don gave Hendrix freedom to play the way he felt, and the two created a sound that was part gospel, part blues, and all rebellion. That collaboration didn't just make a great record, it helped lay the foundation for the bridge between soul and rock. When the Rolling Stones covered Mercy, Mercy a year later, it became clear how far Don's reach extended. Mick Jagger mirrored his phrasing, his rhythm, even his sly delivery. The British invasion might have been taking over American radio, but its pulse came from voices like Don Covay's. He had given them the blueprint, and they didn't even realize it. Now working full-time with Atlantic Records, Don stepped into the company of legends. Memphis musicians like Booker T. Jones and Steve Cropper became his creative partners, giving his songs a tighter, bolder sound. He recorded Please Do Something, Sookie Sookie, and Seesaw, each one pulsing with that unmistakable mix of funk, pain, and joy. Seesaw would become his biggest solo hit, reaching the R&B top 5 and crossing over to the pop charts. For once, the applause was his. But behind every success, Don still carried the quiet fear that it wouldn't last. The industry loved trends, not people, and he knew how easily a voice like his could fade again. Meanwhile, other artists began turning to him for songs that carried meaning. Etta James recorded Watchdog. Aretha Franklin later found gold in his old composition, Chain of Fools. To Don, it was proof that his music had a heartbeat of its own, one that could outlive him. He wrote not for glory, but for truth. His lyrics spoke of betrayal and dignity, of the working man, of the everyday struggle behind the glamour. And every time he stepped to the microphone, he carried that truth in his voice. By 1966, critics began to call him one of the most underrated singer-songwriters in America. He was part preacher, part poet, part showman, too complex for the music business to define, but too real to ignore. In the smoky corners of Atlantic studios, surrounded by the hum of amplifiers and the smell of vinyl, Don Covay was finally living the life he'd imagined as a boy in Washington, D.C. The fame might have come slowly, but it was honest, hard-earned, and entirely his. He wasn't chasing trends. He was building his own legacy one song at a time, one truth at a time. And as Seesaw played on radios across the country, Don Covay stood at the edge of something bigger than success, the beginning of his legend. By 1965, Don Covay was standing at the height of his craft. After years of wandering from label to label, he had finally found a home at Atlantic Records, the same house that nurtured giants like Ray Charles, Aretha Franklin, and Otis Redding. For a man who had spent a decade fighting for recognition, the doors of Atlantic felt like redemption. Inside those studios, everything came alive. Don worked side by side with the best musicians of the South, Booker T. Jones, Steve Cropper, and members of the Stax and Muscle Shoals families. They understood his rhythm, that mix of gospel pulse and street groove that couldn't be taught. Every take was raw, powerful, and human. Please Do Something, Sookie Sookie, and Seesaw poured out of him with unstoppable energy. Each track carried a swagger that was unmistakably his. Seesaw climbed the R&B charts to the top 5 and crossed into the pop top 50, a rare accomplishment for an artist who had built his name on authenticity rather than image. On stage, Don Covay was magnetic. He didn't just sing, he performed. He would strut, twist, and shout like Little Richard, then pull the audience into a quiet ache with the tenderness of Sam Cooke. Critics called him a preacher with rhythm, and fans saw him as a man who could make pain sound beautiful. But even as his voice filled dance halls and radio waves, Don's greatest success came not from performance, but from the songs he gave to others. His lyrics carried honesty, the kind that artists craved. Etta James recorded his Watchdog. Otis Redding drew inspiration from his phrasing. And when Aretha Franklin recorded Chain of Fools, a song Don had written nearly 15 years earlier, the world heard what he had always known, that soul music was more than sound. It was truth. Chain of Fools became one of Aretha's biggest hits, winning her a Grammy and defining the spirit of 1968. Yet few knew the song had been born from Don's pen in a small Washington apartment years before fame ever found him. It was a victory that belonged to him but celebrated by someone else. Still, Don didn't complain. He had learned long ago that art and recognition don't always share the same stage. He took quiet pride in watching his music carry others to greatness. He knew that his legacy wasn't measured by the spotlight, but by the echoes it left behind. As the late 60s rolled on, Don Covay had become a voice of his generation, an architect of the soul era. His name might not have been as loud as his peers, but among musicians, it was spoken with reverence. He was the bridge between gospel and groove, between the church and the street. Every note he sang came from the same place, truth. And in those years, standing under the warm glow of the studio lights, Don Covay had finally found what he'd been chasing all along, not fame, not fortune, but freedom. Fame in the 1960s was a storm, and by the time Don Covay stood in its center, The winds were already changing. The sound of America was shifting fast. Soul was giving way to funk, and rock was becoming louder, more political, more white. For a black songwriter who had built his name on subtlety and story, there was little room left on the charts. At Atlantic, Don kept recording, "You Put Something on Me," "Somebody's Got to Love You," and "Say Goodbye." The songs were strong, the voice still rich, but the hits didn't come. Each release felt like a quiet plea to an industry that was already moving on. He had seen it before, artists with everything to say, suddenly left with no one listening. He poured himself into one last ambitious idea, a collective of soul giants who could stand together against a system that divided them. He called it the Soul Clan. It was a brotherhood: Solomon Burke, Ben E. King, Joe Tex, Arthur Conley, and Don Covay himself. Each of them had carried the weight of the genre. Each had fought the same uphill battle for control, respect, and credit. They gathered in 1968 under the Atlantic banner, determined to prove that unity could still make magic. Their single soul meeting was an anthem of pride, a declaration that the roots of soul still ran deep. For a brief moment, it looked like history was being rewritten, 5 men reclaiming their power through the very music they helped create. But the dream didn't last. The record only reached the lower rungs of the R&B charts. The public had turned its attention to newer sounds, psychedelic rock, Motown pop, and the British invasion that Don himself had unknowingly influenced. Even within the label, executives saw the project as nostalgic rather than revolutionary. When the lights went down on the Soul Clan, it wasn't just a failed collaboration, it was a symbol, a sign that the world no longer wanted what these men had to give. Still, Don didn't stop creating. He formed the Jefferson Lemon Blues Band, chasing a raw, freer sound blues rock mixed with soul and folk. It was daring, even ahead of its time, but too unconventional for radio. The record sold modestly, but among musicians, it was seen as fearless. He had always been a step ahead, too soulful for rock, too rebellious for soul. That duality, the same thing that once made him special, now made him hard to market. By the close of the decade, Don Covay was watching the stage lights dim. The applause was softer, the crowds smaller. Yet he never seemed bitter. He would smile, tip his hat, and remind those around him, "The music never left me. It just changed clothes." It was that grace, the ability to face decline with dignity, that separated Don from the rest. He wasn't just another fading star, he was a survivor. And even as the 70s approached, with all their new rhythms and rising stars, Don Covay remained what he had always been, the quiet heartbeat of soul. When the 60s faded into memory, so did much of the world Don Covay had built his name in. The sound of soul, the music that once carried the heart of a nation, was changing. Funk, disco, and polished studio production began to replace the raw storytelling he loved. For an artist who had always lived between genres, the new decade felt like walking through a city he no longer recognized. After the disappointment of the Soul Clan, Don turned to something different. In 1969, he formed the Jefferson Lemon Blues Band with Joe Richardson and bluesman John Hammond. Together, they created the House of Blue Lights, an album that mixed deep Southern blues with the restless energy of rock. It wasn't made for radio, it was made for feeling. And even though it didn't climb the charts, the track Black Woman reached the R&B Top 50, a small, glowing victory amid a changing tide. But Don wasn't chasing trends, he was chasing honesty. The blues gave him that. He'd been singing about heartbreak his whole life. Now, he was living it. Every note felt heavier, more personal. His songs sounded like late-night confessions whispered into an empty room. In 1970, he signed with Janus Records and recorded Different Strokes for Different Folks. It was another attempt to reinvent himself, part funk, part blues, part protest. Critics admired it, but the public barely noticed. The industry had already moved on to younger faces, fresher sounds, and safer formulas. Still, Don kept working. He joined Mercury Records not only as a performer, but as an A&R executive, helping other artists find their voice while quietly fighting to preserve his own. He poured his heart into a new record, Super Dude, released in 1973. The album was electric, bold, funky, unapologetically soulful. Songs like "I Was Checking Out While She Was Checking In" and "Somebody's Been Enjoying My Home" struck a perfect balance between humor and heartbreak. Critics called it his masterpiece, a reminder that the old fire hadn't gone out. The record returned him briefly to the charts, giving him his last taste of commercial success. For a moment, it felt like redemption, the world finally seeing the genius it had overlooked. But behind that comeback, Don was exhausted. Years of touring, disappointment, and creative battles had worn him down. The music industry demanded constant reinvention, and he had given it everything he had. By the mid-1970s, he found himself watching younger artists, people who had grown up on his sound, take the spotlight. Don was proud, but also quietly aware that his time as a headliner was slipping away. Still, he didn't stop writing. He never could. Even as the world changed around him, Don Covay kept doing what he'd always done, turning life into music, one truth at a time. By the late 1970s, Don Covay was no longer the voice filling radio stations or dance halls. The industry had changed again, smoother, flashier, and less forgiving. He recorded a few independent projects like Back to the Roots in 1977 and Bad Boy in 1980, but the spark that once lit every studio session now flickered quietly in the background. The man who had written hits for the biggest names in soul was living in the shadow of his own songs. He'd walk into a club, hear Chain of Fools or Mercy Mercy, and smile softly as the crowd sang along, unaware that the man who created them was sitting just a few tables away. That was the strange curse of his life. His work was immortal, but his name was fading. The 1980 brought more silence than applause. Don took on small writing and production gigs, mentoring younger artists who didn't even realize how much of his sound had shaped theirs. He had become a quiet figure respected among musicians, but largely invisible to the public. Then, in 1986, a familiar name called the Rolling Stones, who had once built their early sound from his songs, invited him to sing background vocals on their album Dirty Work. It was a full-circle moment, the student calling back the teacher. Don accepted without hesitation. For him, it wasn't about fame anymore. It was about being part of the music, about connection. In 1992, everything changed. Don suffered a severe stroke that left him partially paralyzed. For a man whose life had been built on movement and voice, it was a cruel twist of fate. The same hands that once wrote timeless songs could no longer play, and the voice that once commanded a stage could barely speak. But Don was not the kind of man to surrender easily. He went through years of therapy, slowly regaining some strength. When the Rhythm and Blues Foundation honored him with a Pioneer Award in 1993, he couldn't attend the ceremony. Yet the tribute reminded the world and him that he had mattered, that his work had not disappeared. He spent much of the 1,990 inches quiet recovery, surrounded by friends and family. In 2000, he surprised everyone with Ad-Lib, his first studio album in nearly 25 years. The voice was softer, the tempo slower, but the soul was still there, weathered, wiser, and deeply human. Even when his body betrayed him, Don's spirit never did. His music continued to echo through generations who didn't know his face but felt his touch. He had given the world everything he had, and though the world had moved on, the songs refused to die. For Don Covay, the real reward was never in applause. It was in the sound of a melody that still reached someone, somewhere, long after the lights went out. When the world finally paused to look back, it realized something remarkable. Don Covay had never really left. His name might have faded from headlines, but his fingerprints were all over American music. Every rhythm, every rasp of soul that came after him carried a piece of his voice. To musicians, Don Covay was more than a singer, he was a blueprint. The fusion of gospel depth, R&B grit, and rock rebellion that defined his sound became the DNA of modern soul. He was the thread connecting the sacred and the secular, the preacher's son who taught the world how to turn pain into poetry. In the years after his stroke, younger artists began rediscovering his work. They studied his phrasing, his songwriting, his ability to make joy and sorrow sound like the same emotion. They found that every lyric he wrote carried both the church and the street, faith and fire, discipline and danger. That balance made his music timeless. Even those who didn't know his story felt his presence. Listen closely to any Rolling Stones record from the mid-1960s, and you'll hear it, that slurred rhythm, that confident ache that came straight from Mercy, Mercy. Mick Jagger once admitted that Covay's phrasing had shaped his entire vocal style. The British invasion, for all its power, owed much of its soul to the man from South Carolina. But Don's influence didn't stop there. In America, he was a quiet mentor to dozens of younger acts coming up through the 1970 and 1980. He was the bridge between the raw power of blues and the smooth groove of funk. Artists like Wilson Pickett, Joe Tex, and Solomon Burke had all sung his songs. Others, from Etta James to Aretha Franklin, found their greatest moments through his writing. Chain of Fools, written by Don years before Aretha recorded it, became one of the most powerful anthems in the history of soul music. It was more than just a hit. It was a statement, a cry for dignity, wrapped in rhythm. Aretha's voice gave it life, but the truth behind the song was pure Don Covay, direct, wounded, and defiant. When people talk about the golden age of R&B, they often mention the giants Ray Charles, Sam Cooke, Otis Redding. But quietly, behind them, was Don Covay, the man who gave those giants their songs, their stories, their language. By the late 1990s, as retrospectives and documentaries revisited the roots of American soul, Don's name started appearing again. Critics who had once overlooked him began calling him a national treasure hiding in plain sight. His songwriting was reappraised not as a footnote but as a foundation. And when his 2000 album Ad-Lib was released, it didn't break sales records, but it broke hearts. Fans who remembered him from decades earlier said it felt like hearing an old friend return from a long journey. The voice was older, the tone rougher, but the message was the same: love, loss, and the eternal rhythm of the human soul. For Don Covay, legacy wasn't about fame, it was about connection. And long after his time, the connection still remains every time someone sings a line that sounds just a little too honest, a little too raw, a little too real. When Don Covay passed away on the 31st of January 2015, the news barely made headlines. There were no grand tributes on television, no long retrospectives on primetime shows. But in the corners of the music world, among the singers, writers, and players who knew his name, there was silence. The kind of silence that comes from losing someone who shaped everything around you. In the weeks that followed, musicians from every corner of the industry began to speak his name again. Rolling Stone magazine called him one of the most influential soul architects of the 20th century. Billboard wrote that his voice and pen had rewired the sound of rhythm and blues. And across social media, artists from different generations, from classic soul singers to modern R&B stars, paid tribute to the man whose words had once carried their pain before they even had the language for it. For the general public, his death sparked discovery. People started to realize that many of the songs they'd loved for decades, Chain of Fools, Mercy, Mercy, Seesaw, all traced back to the same man. Record stores began selling out of old Atlantic compilations. Radio stations revisited his catalog. Younger listeners searched his name, surprised that someone so central to the sound of soul had remained so invisible. It was as if the world was finally catching up to the truth musicians had always known, that Don Covay wasn't a side note in the story of soul, he was a pillar. His songs had been the quiet bridges between genres, between people, between eras. He connected gospel to groove, the church to the street, and the South to the world. Outside of America, his influence had long been recognized. In Europe, collectors and critics had preserved his work with reverence. British and German labels reissued his albums, often describing him as the missing link between Ray Charles and the Rolling Stones. In Japan, soul enthusiasts treated him like royalty. They studied his records the way others studied poetry, with care and devotion. What made Don Covay special wasn't just his ability to write a hit. It was the humanity behind every lyric. He understood struggle, forgiveness, and grace in ways that couldn't be taught. When he sang, it felt like a prayer disguised as a groove. When he wrote, it felt like a sermon meant for anyone who had ever been forgotten. Today, his story stands as a reminder not just of the music he left behind, but of the cost of genius in a world that doesn't always reward it. Don Covay didn't need statues or trophies to prove his worth. His legacy is carried in the songs that still move people to dance, to cry, to remember. He was, and remains, one of the quiet heroes of American soul. And though the spotlight may have dimmed, The echo of his truth, raw, real, and everlasting, still lingers in every note that bears his name. The studio is quiet again now. The lights have dimmed, and the microphone that once carried his voice stands in the same silence it did all those years ago. But if you listen closely, you can still hear something, a whisper of melody, a trace of rhythm, a man's truth refusing to fade. Don Covay never needed the fame that others chased. What he wanted was something deeper, to be heard, to be felt, to make music that spoke to the soul of ordinary people. And he did. Every note he ever sang, every word he ever wrote, was a reflection of the world as he saw it. Unfair, beautiful, complicated, and worth singing about. From the church pews of South Carolina to the neon lights of Atlantic Records, his journey was never about spotlight or recognition. It was about honesty. He was the kind of artist who gave everything he had to the song and asked for nothing in return. That's what made him timeless, and what makes his story so haunting. When Aretha Franklin sang Chain of Fools, she gave voice to his spirit. When the Rolling Stones borrowed his sound, they carried his influence across oceans. When modern artists speak of soul, they are, whether they know it or not, speaking his language. Don Covay may not have died a household name, but his music never left the house. It's in the air, in the rhythm, in the way a generation learned to feel through sound. His story reminds us that greatness doesn't always come wrapped in fame sometimes. It lives quietly, waiting to be rediscovered. He once said that music was the only thing that ever made sense to him. Maybe that's why, even now, his songs still make sense to us, still speak to something real inside the noise of the world. So tonight, if you ever find yourself listening to Mercy, Mercy, let the words sink in. Remember the man who gave them to us. Do you think Hollywood ever gave Don Covay the respect he truly deserved? If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button, leave a comment, and help us keep the memory of Don Covay and all of Hollywood's forgotten legends alive. Because some stars never fade. They just shine where fewer eyes can see.